Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I have allergies today. And I made decisions that brought those allergies upon me, and so I deserve it, but I got no regrets. Last night, the kids were all sleeping over at other places. My wife and I put on Ted Lasso, and that guy's just unflinchingly optimistic. It's delightful. It's contagious. And in my optimism, I was like, you know what? There's a beautiful spring shower going on outside. I'm going to open the windows. And I'm taking off the screens. Like, I want the full experience. So we're sitting there, we're watching. It's just amazing. Cool breeze. What a wonderful, wonderful night with my favorite human, watching a delightful program. And then I went down to bed and put my head on the pillow, and the pressure changed a little bit. You know how that happens? And you start to feel congested, and you're like, oh, I'm going to pay an allergy price for the decisions I made to open those windows on that kind of breezy evening. Huh. Well, it was worth it. And that discussion of my allergies is 60 seconds of your life you're never getting back. Time for the next 60 seconds you're never getting back. I haven't put out a video on YouTube in forever. And the reason for that is because I've been really workshopping a couple of projects. I've written a couple little sketches that I think are kind of cute. One in particular about the book of Exodus. Well, I guess both the ones I'm working on right now are about the book of Exodus. And when I make a video like that, I'll send it out to a few friends and have them give me their feedback. And I got a bunch of helpful feedback from a whole bunch of people, including one friend who said, I don't know, this one might be a little bit on the nose. Looks like you're really drawing comparisons between two things, which was not my initial objective, but more on that later. The book's just about Exodus, and Exodus is a book that is both loaded with symbolism that is easy to draw parallels with moving forward in the Bible as well as just in modern life. But it's also a book that gets pretty dark. There's a lot of death and slavery and atrocities and just horrible things happen, but also beautiful things happen. And it's a story about God superintending a very difficult time. It again plays off of the theme of the clown king who imagines that he's the sovereign of everything, but God, who is largely unseen, completely thwarts and manhandles the will of the king who imagines he's so important. And Pharaoh comes out looking like a clown. God demonstrates his power over everything and delivers the Hebrew people from a horrible situation, an impossible situation, into a covenant with him. He formalizes this relationship between himself and the Hebrew people. He's going to be their God. They're going to be his people. If they obey him, he's going to bless them, and everybody will know that he's the one true God. If they disobey him, he's going to punish them, and everybody will still know that he's the one true God. So this salvation event in Egypt and through the waters of baptism of the Red Sea, you see what I'm doing here, initiates this new arrangement, this new deal, this new family of faith covenant between God and his chosen people, and that sets the trajectory for the rest of the Old Testament. And as we go through the remaining books of the Pentateuch, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the rest of Exodus, we see that there's a whole elaborate system set up here that deals with guilt and sin you know about, guilt and sin you didn't even know about, guilt and sin that is corporate in nature and not individual. There's all of these elaborate details about what it takes to atone for that sin and to maintain this relationship with God through this sacrificial system. And of course, nowhere is that sacrificial system more demonstrated in Exodus than in Egypt with the last plague, with the Passover lamb being slaughtered, and as ancient Near Eastern and superstitious as it sounds, the blood being placed around the door that causes the Lord or the angel of death, depending on which translation you're looking at or how you read it or interpret that night and that action. It causes the death to pass over the houses that have the blood of the lamb on the door. You can see how much language I just used here casually and without even trying very hard. That sounds a lot like the New Testament language. So let's think about what's happening now as we're in Matthew 26 with the whole Jesus story. Jesus looks a lot like a new and greater Moses. He's descended from the right people. He goes through a refining process in the wilderness. He comes back to lead his people not out of political slavery, but out of spiritual slavery and darkness, where God used Moses to deliver his people from death and into this new ethnic family of faith. So Jesus shows up and makes it clear that he is going to defeat death. And in doing so, he is going to create a new family of faith, stuff that he's alluded to in the end of Matthew chapter 12, and that we looked at a whole bunch the other day. I don't need to cover all of that again. In the same way that the blood of the Old Testament lamb stays the hand of death, so through Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection, which we see coming from a mile away here based on all the stuff that Jesus says, death is defeated once and for all. In the Old Testament, all of this stuff sounds temporary. All of this stuff seems to be chronologically hitched to a set of circumstances, a moment, one specific deal for one specific people. But with this new covenant, or this new family of faith that happens on the other side of the waters of baptism that Jesus leads his people through to create this new covenant, the deal would seem to be permanent, that death is defeated, the kingdom is established, and all of the Old Testament story arcs are fulfilled. And so in the same way that perhaps early drafts of my Exodus videos came out, even if somewhat accidentally, a little bit on the nose in terms of seeming to draw analogies between then and now, so this stuff in Matthew 26, where Jesus is the Passover lamb, where there's this new family of faith, this new covenant being established, it's a lot on the nose. And it would have been understood by the original audience as being entirely on the nose. So much so that Matthew doesn't even see fit in the next 2.5 chapters he has to work with to spell out everything that I just said. Now, all of these themes are super evident. I mean, dun, 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 dun is the sound the Old Testament makes, and Jesus makes the sound, dun, dun. He completes it. He rounds it out. The theme verse of the book of Matthew is Matthew 5:17. Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. He is completing outstanding narrative arcs that are begging for completion, and Matthew is writing to an audience that is so steeped in all of that story and all of that law and poetry and prophecy that he's assuming they can connect the dots. We're totally tracking with what you're saying about Jesus. It speaks for itself. This is the completion of the story, and that was going to make some people mad and make them want to burn things down, and that was going to make some other people feel hope and want to say, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Christ is here, just like Peter ended up saying. So for you and me, this Last Supper language in Matthew 26, like we talked about whenever that was yesterday, is going to feel a little bit, if you go to church a lot, like just, man, this is stuff you say in church. This is part of the liturgy, part of the rhythm and repetition of what you do in a church service around communion. But when this hit the original audience for the first time, what they would have heard loud and clear was, dang, that is completely on the nose. We see exactly what you are doing. We understand the implications. And what you are saying is that the old covenant has been completed. The deal we've been operating under since as far back as anybody can just about remember, the religious constitution we've operated with God under is being completed, refined, and fulfilled. All of the spots that ultimately could never fully work have now been made to fully work. Instead of a temporary sacrifice, a permanent sacrifice. Instead of something that stays the hand of the angel of death, the hand of God, for a moment. Instead, with the sacrifice of the new Lamb of God, Christ himself, God's own Son, the hand of death is not just stayed, it is completely defeated and thwarted forever. And in all of this, a new deal, a new covenant is initiated. The old one, people couldn't hold up their end. The new one takes into account total human frailty and brokenness at the individual level and at the national level, and creates a new family of faith that the old one begged for. So when Jesus says in verse 27, "Drink from it, all of you, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins," this would not have been received as a subtle nod back to the Passover. This would have been immediately recognized as a bold claim, a proclamation that the old is gone and the new is come. And in more recent memory, it would have hearkened back to the stuff about old wine and new wineskins, that those old structures, that old covenant could not contain the newness and fullness of what Christ was establishing here. He is intentionally using covenant language, but he is not using this language in a vacuum. He's using this language in the context of the Passover meal and everything else that he's said and done throughout this entire process. And in the same way that you wouldn't miss it if some religious leader got up in some very strange or dangerous way at some sort of Christmas service, was like, and today God is reborn in the flesh through me, cult leader Tad, here in Boca Raton, Florida. You'd be like, whoa, 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 I don't agree with you, but I see exactly what you're saying. You make that kind of announcement on Christmas, a day we remember the incarnation. That's not a coincidence. We see what you're trying to do, weird cult leader guy. In the same way here, everybody got it, except the difference between weird cult leader guy and Jesus is Jesus' actions, his breaking of the law of time and space, his wisdom, his pedigree, everything said that he had every right to make such a claim and could back up such a claim. This is not just a quick biscuit and beverage. This is the establishment of a new covenant. This is Jesus providing context to what's about to happen on the cross and in his resurrection. And there's a reason that Christians all around the world, for the entire history of Christianity, have cherished and latched onto this event and imitated this event again and again as they've gathered for 2,000 years. It's because at the very least, it is a reminder, maybe even a renewal of this new covenant that Christ's new family of faith has with him. Is it a little on the nose? Oh yes, it's very on the nose, and that is absolutely on purpose. I very much look forward to sharing my Exodus videos with you at some point here in the near future. They are uncomfortable, but they make me giggle, and hopefully they'll make people want to read the Bible, which is kind of the objective of those videos. Sorry about my allergy voice. Thanks for hanging out with me anyway. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.